It all started as a simple family vacation, nothing out of the ordinary. But the moment I stepped into that forest, I realized how quickly everything could spiral into a nightmare. It was 11 years ago, when I was just 8 years old. My family, my mum, dad, brother, and his girlfriend, decided to take a holiday to visit some relatives on my mum's side in rural Victoria, Australia. The place itself was remote, nestled between wide, empty fields with dense forests stretching out in the distance. My grandparents' house sat at the edge of it all, where the only sounds were the wind and the occasional bird call. One day, my mom, an avid bird watcher, and I decided to go for a walk. My brother's girlfriend, Lisa, who shared our fascination with wildlife, came along too. We wandered down a dirt trail for about 10 minutes, snapping photos of birds and small animals. It was peaceful at first, but little did I know the real danger was waiting just out of sight. As we walked, we passed a group of bikers gathered by a fire. There were about 7 of them, casually cooking up some food. One of the bikers smiled and waved politely as my mum nodded in return, but as we moved to continue, another biker approached us. He looked tired, rough even, his eyes squinting against the setting sun. "Where you heading?" he asked. My mom explained we were just out for a walk, and the biker gave us an unsettling warning. He mentioned that people had been using the forest for shooting games, and there were rumors of aggressive dogs in the area. He suggested we be careful and tread lightly. We continued on, but the foreboding feeling that lingered in the air seemed to hang over us like a dark cloud. Then I saw it. An old barn off the trail, weathered by time, with an eerie presence that seemed to call to me. I bolted toward it, eager to explore. Mom and Lisa stayed behind, engrossed in watching a bird, unaware of my detour. As I got closer to the barn, a foul smell hit me, a stench that made my stomach turn. I was about 3 feet from an old mattress, stained with dark brown marks. The sight alone made my skin crawl, but what stood out the most were the dogs. 3 massive Rottweilers chained up outside, growling and snapping. They were vicious, their barks ringing in my ears. But it was the man who stepped out of the barn that I'll never forget. He was tall, easily 6'4", with a large, worn blue pinstriped suit and a top hat that was far too big for his head. His clothes looked as though they'd been through hell, faded and dirty. His face was red, like he'd been working under the sun all day, except for the parts obscured by a thick, untamed beard. The man smiled at me, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I froze, unsure of what to make of him. "Do you like doggies?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice, his hand twitching as though he wanted to reach out. "Are you a magician?" I asked, nervously trying to make sense of his strange appearance. "No, mate," he chuckled, stepping closer. "I just look after the doggies. Want to come inside? Have your picture taken with them?" My heart raced. Something about his offer felt off, but before I could react, I heard my mum's voice cutting through the air, her tone sharp with concern. We hadn't gone far before I turned around and noticed something terrifying. The man was following us, walking faster and faster, his long legs closing the distance between us with alarming speed. "Mom!" I screamed, panic rising in my chest. "He's following us!" My mom's face turned white as she looked back and saw him too. The man's face was expressionless, his movements deliberate. "Get away from us!" she yelled, her voice trembling with fear, but he didn't stop. He kept walking toward us, unfazed. My mum, now in full flight mode, grabbed me and began sprinting down the trail, practically dragging me along. I could hear her gasping for breath as she pushed herself faster, her heart pounding in her chest. And then I heard something that chilled me to my core. Footsteps. The man was running after us. Suddenly my mom stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. She picked me up and ran even faster, her screams for help echoing through the forest. Lisa was behind us, trying to keep up. But then, to my horror, the man grabbed my leg. My mom screamed in terror as Lisa lunged at him, scratching and clawing at his face in a desperate attempt to free me. He threw her off like she was nothing. But as he was distracted, my mom delivered a swift kick to his groin. With the man disoriented, we made our move, running as fast as we could. We didn't look back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, still coming for us. Just when I thought we were about to be caught, we emerged into a clearing where the bikers had set up camp. My mom screamed, "Help! He's trying to kidnap my son!" The bikers reacted instantly. One of them bolted into the trees after the man, but the magician, who was no longer smiling, turned on his heel and ran off into the forest. The biker pursued him, but the man managed to disappear into the woods. After the chaos, the bikers were kind enough to offer us a ride. We climbed onto their motorcycle, my mum clutching me tight, and they took us to the nearest town. We went straight to the police station where my mom filed a report. That was the last time we ever saw the magician, but the images of that man, the top hat, the sinister smile, and the way he moved, have never left me. It wasn't until later, when we spoke to the bikers again, that we learned something even more chilling. The man had been coming to the street at night, watching from his car with tinted windows, his eyes never leaving our neighbors. It makes me shudder to think back on it. There were nights after visiting my girlfriend or walking home that I passed a car parked on our street. It was always empty, the windows dark, and I never thought twice. But now, I wonder, was that the magician waiting for his next chance? If that biker is listening, thank you. You'll never know how much you saved us that day. It started as a typical road trip with a friend. At least that's how we thought it would go. A simple adventure through the central Queensland outback, hunting for dinosaur fossils and tracks. But the outback has a way of twisting even the most innocent plans into something far darker. We were both science geeks, zoology nerds to be precise, and when we'd heard about the famous dinosaur trail spread across Winton, Richmond, and Hughenden, all areas known for ancient bones and fossilized footprints, we couldn't resist. We packed up my old Nissan X-Trail and hit the road, determined to uncover what lay hidden in the dry expanse of the outback. The drive was long, but we were excited, fueled by the thought of seeing real dinosaur footprints. The sun blazed down, unforgiving. 3 hours in, my car's air conditioning decided to quit. For anyone who's ever driven through Australia's summer heat, you'll understand how cruel that is. The air was thick, suffocating, no relief in sight. To make things worse, my GPS gave out too. The map software just couldn't register our location. So there we were, no AC, no GPS, and only old paper maps to guide us through the vast, unmarked wilderness. It was a nightmare for anyone used to modern tech, especially in the barren, dust-swept landscape of the outback. But we pressed on. We finally reached the trail, and for a few hours, things were great. Dinosaur bones, fossilized footprints, it was everything we had hoped for. The kind of stuff that made all the hassle worth it. But the sun was dipping lower, and we knew we had to leave before darkness set in. As we packed up to go, a man in his late 60s, dressed in all khaki and camo gear, appeared. He seemed like he belonged there, an odd character, but no red flags yet. He asked where we were headed, and when I mentioned we were staying in a town about 3 hours away, he gave me a strange, almost distrustful look. My friend, who was more friendly and open, mentioned our town by name, and the man seemed to take a real liking to him. Then, with a grin that felt more like a sneer, he told us we'd taken the long way and that there was a shortcut, a route that would save us an hour. We were relieved. No one likes extra time in a hot car, and an hour less seemed like a blessing. He gave us vague directions, pointing down a dusty road that wound through the empty landscape. Despite the odd vibe, we didn't think much of it. Who wouldn't appreciate a shortcut, right? We followed the path, but after what felt like an eternity, something started to feel off. The road seemed endless, and the sun was beginning to sink lower, casting long shadows. My heart rate quickened. The gas tank was down to a quarter, and there were no signs of civilization. No houses, no other cars. Just dirt and dry brush stretching out into nothingness. My gut was screaming at me that we were heading in the wrong direction. I stopped the car, pulling out binoculars from the back seat, hoping to spot something, anything to guide us. In the distance, I saw it. A structure, maybe a house. It was the only thing that could be remotely helpful out here. We headed toward it cautiously. As we got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a house at all. It was an old caravan, burned out and blackened, a twisted shell of what it once was. There were animal bones strung up all around it, some with grass or hair woven into them, like some kind of ritualistic display. At the entrance stood a cow skull, its empty eye sockets staring at us with an unsettling intensity. Then I noticed the sign. A hand-painted, weathered piece of wood stuck in the ground Moonlight Motel. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt wrong, but before I could voice my concern, my friend pointed at something else. A car. It was kicking up dust as it came towards us, fast. It hadn't been behind us when we left the dinosaur trail. And yet here it was, only moments from catching up. That's when we heard it. A scratching sound, slow, deliberate, coming from inside the burned-out caravan. I couldn't look away. I felt like I had to go closer. That's when I saw him. Someone peering through a hole in the wall, his eyes wide and watching us intently. Then the voice. It wasn't a child's voice, it was a man's, deliberate and haunting, mimicking a child's innocent tone. "Are you here to play with me?" We froze. A chill ran through me, every muscle in my body locking up. We didn't even exchange words, we just turned and ran, desperate to get away from whatever twisted nightmare we had stumbled into. As I jumped into the car and started reversing, the other car pulled up behind us. The high beams flashed on, blinding me. I couldn't see the driver, but there was no way out. The road was too narrow and they were blocking us in. With nowhere else to go, I slammed the gear shift into drive and sped forward, nearly hitting the Moonlight Motel sign in my haste. The other car didn't follow. It stayed in the rearview mirror, its headlights still burning in the fading twilight. We made it back to the dinosaur trail, hearts racing, hands trembling. The adrenaline was still coursing through us. We joked nervously, chalking it all up to a strange encounter. Maybe the other driver was just trying to get our attention. Maybe they needed help. But then, when we went to the front desk, the woman there gave us an odd look when I mentioned the man who'd given us directions. "What man?" she asked. I described him, and her face paled. "He doesn't work here," she said, her voice trembling. "He was asked to leave today. He's been bothering tourists, trying to get them to stay at his place. The Moonlight Motel." I couldn't breathe. He wasn't just some eccentric old man. He was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. And whatever it was, it still haunted the roads of the outback, waiting for the next lost traveler to stumble across the Moonlight Motel. I never forgot that night, and I never want to go back to the outback again. It was just another ordinary Saturday, or at least that's how I thought it would be. Back in 2008, I was living with my parents and sister in Brisbane, Australia. I was 19 at the time, and life was typical for a young adult trying to navigate the strange mix of freedom and responsibility. My father had recently splurged on Foxtel, our cable television provider, but there was a catch. Only the living room TV could access the cable box. Naturally, I wanted it in my room without having to fork out for a second box. So my dad, in his usual problem-solving manner, went out and bought an AV transmitter receiver, a nifty device that would allow me to connect the cable to my TV without any major investment. It seemed like a harmless project, just a few wires, some tinkering, and I'd have cable in my room. I had no idea that this simple setup would soon thrust me into a nightmare I would never forget. I remember sitting there staring at the cables and small boxes, fiddling with connections. My younger sister, who was 16 at the time, was upstairs in her room. It was just me, the AV system, and the quiet of the house. At first, nothing was working. The signal kept cutting in and out. I had expected a few hiccups, but it wasn't until I started seeing the faintest flickers of a picture that I knew something was off. I still remember the exact moment it happened. The screen started fuzzing, a common sight with faulty connections, but then something didn't feel right. The image on the screen slowly started to form, and my breath caught in my throat. The TV flickered, and suddenly there it was. A bed. A messy, unmade bed, almost like it was waiting for someone to sleep in it. I froze. My heart pounded as I stared, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me. That wasn't my bed. I remember my hands trembling as I rushed upstairs to my sister. I was terrified, my thoughts spiraling. I told her to come down, to see for herself. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. Together, we stood in front of the screen, trying to make sense of it. But neither of us recognized the bed. It wasn't mine, and it certainly wasn't hers. The image didn't make any sense. Where was it coming from? We both knew something was off, but the idea of a hidden camera never crossed our minds. But when the figure in the image came into focus, we realized just how wrong we were. We watched in silence as our neighbor, a man who lived just next door, walked into the frame. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized him. He was someone we knew, someone who had always been friendly enough. But what happened next would forever change our perception of him. He walked into the room, his back turned to the camera, completely unaware of our gaze. It was a typical ordinary scene, until he started rifling through the drawers. At first we thought it was just curiosity or perhaps an innocent search for something misplaced. But then he did something that made my stomach churn. He pulled out a pair of his wife's underwear, slowly raising them to his nose. My mind raced, trying to process what I was witnessing. We had no words, only stunned silence. It was too embarrassing to look away from, but I couldn't look away. And then the worst part happened. The man who had been fumbling with the camera as if unaware of its presence turned. His eyes locked directly into the lens, as if he knew someone was watching him. We froze. My mom called my dad immediately, but I couldn't look away. I felt exposed, like he was looking into my soul. My mom was horrified, and I knew she was thinking what I was thinking. He knew we were watching. When my dad arrived home, he didn't waste any time. He went straight next door, knocking on the door of our seemingly friendly neighbor. My heart raced as he asked about what we had seen, but the neighbor played it off like it was all a misunderstanding. They had no idea what we were talking about, my dad later told us. They seemed genuinely confused. But there was no mistaking the camera feed we had seen. My dad, still uneasy, was allowed to check their room. What he found turned our world upside down. Behind the camera was an innocuous device installed by the plumber, meant to monitor water usage due to Brisbane's ongoing drought. But the plumber had secretly placed a camera behind it, aimed directly at their bed. The realization hit hard. Our neighbor's secret, dark obsession had been exposed. But there was more to this than just a hidden camera in a neighbor's house. This plumber, he was watching us too. A week passed before the police got involved. They took over the investigation, and though things seemed to settle down, a part of me couldn't forget what we had seen. The creeping unease followed me every night. Every time I left the house, the thought of hidden cameras or prying eyes lingered like a shadow. Then, weeks later, my mom casually spoke to the wife next door. What she learned chilled me to the bone. The wife had confessed that the plumber had a routine. At night, he would drive down our street in his station wagon, parked a distance away from the house with tinted windows. He would sit there, in the darkness, watching them through his laptop. My mom's voice trembled when she told me, but it didn't stop there. As I listened, my blood turned cold. I remembered nights when I would walk home from my girlfriend's house or just late-night strolls, passing by the very station wagon parked at the same spot. I had always assumed it belonged to someone else, but now I shuddered to think what had been happening while I was oblivious. It's been years since that disturbing time. My family and I still talk about it, sometimes in a laugh, but always with a lingering sense of unease. The images from that hidden camera are burned into my mind, and even though we've all moved on, the terror of knowing we were watched is something that never fully fades. So if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, where things feel a little too weird to explain, don't brush it off. Trust your instincts, because there may be someone or something lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting, and you'll never know until it's too late.